Okay, welcome to LabView for Data Analysis Part 1. What we're going to do is we're going to make this simple program for data browsing. So what we have here is a time series, just data that I got from the internet. And I can take these cursors and slide them through and look at a region of interest within these time data. And that region of interest is shown down here in this other plot. So see, it's dynamically updating. And it's also plotting the mean and the standard deviation of these data within these cursor regions. And then we can do some other tricks too. So the first step, I'm just going to stop that, is just to grab some data. And how do we get data into LabView? Exchange rate history, click on this, get your data, it can be whatever you want. And I just clicked here, cell, paste it in. It's not quite in the right format, so I'm just going to do my text to columns and say it's delimited by space and finish that. And I get rid of the first column. Okay, so here we have 3 columns of data. I don't really care what they mean. Save this as a tab delimited text file. Text tab delimited, save it whatever you want. And I've actually already done that, so I'm going to skip this step. And then so we have our saved tab delimited text file. So I just copy paste that in this user input. I'll show you how to actually build these things later. Or you can do that just by hitting this dialog box. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and show you. Okay, so let's start building this, what's called virtual instrument, or VI. So I'm going to make a new blank one, Control N, and then do Control T, as in Thomas, and the Control T just puts them side by side. So if you're not familiar with LabView, left-hand side with the graph paper looking background is the user interface side, and on the other side is what's called the block diagram, or the code that underlies this user interface side. So the first thing we're going to do is stick on our file path dialog. And so I'll go on here, right click. You can also pin this down if you want to have the controls menu there. So we need a file path dialog. So text controls, file path control. Alright, fine. And just call it, sample data. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And notice how we have a browse button here. The browse button is optional. If it's not on there, just say visible items, select browse button. And I usually like to make it really big. And so I'm going to look for my data, and I know it's in here somewhere. Where is it? Here, sterling exchange rate. Come on, okay. There we go. And I'll make this bigger so I can see it. Make it longer, whatever. Okay, now whenever I run this program, I want to have it by default be this value. So right click, data operations, make current value default. Okay? Now, let me just save this, save as something. Save as your data analysis demo. And I'll just call it demo 1. Put that underscore there so it doesn't confuse with the one that's already open. Okay, so now we have our text box, or our file path indicator control. Okay, so now you can see on the block diagram we have our file path control. And so what I have to do is link that to an open spreadsheet command. So I'm going to right click here and get my functions. And all of this express stuff, in my opinion, is junk. So I go down to this double arrow to get the real interesting stuff, and I lost it. I'll have to do it again. Okay, here we go. I'll just pin that down for now. So programming side, now what I need is to go to the file IO, get a read spreadsheet function, and I just wire this in. Hopefully you're familiar with LabView wiring. Okay. So now we need to display the data. So I'll make a chart, like we saw before. I'll choose waveform graph. That's just kind of the simplest thing for now. And I'll make this fancier later. And in the original file it's called raw data input, so I'll just click on this and change it. Input. Okay. Now I'm going to have the data go in here. Now, if you're not familiar with LabView, this green wire here is just file path information, and this double orange, the double represents the fact that it's two-dimensional data, so columns by rows. It just means it's spreadsheet data going into this box, which corresponds to this here. And by the way, if we want to find out the corresponding object between the front panel and the block diagram, just double click on it, and it'll highlight it. Vice versa, double click on this, it'll zoom in, go there. Okay, so now we can run this, and we see complete gibberish. And the reason for that is I haven't transposed the data. So LabView is assuming the data are organized in rows, but it's really organized in columns. So it's totally gibberish. So what we're going to do is go down and right click under this transpose option and say create constant. And in this case it's just what's called a Boolean constant, a true or false. You click, or you hold the mouse over it until you get this little hand symbol, and you hit true. So now we're transposing it, so it's displaying in columns versus rows. We go, okay, now we see 3 columns worth of data. Now they're kind of hard to see, so I'm just going to convince you that there are 3 columns there. So by that, I'm going to make a little zoom in thing. Right click, visible items, graph palette. Okay, see how we get these little options here. Choose the middle one, which is magnifying glass, the zoom, and then we can zoom in on a region of interest. Like that, see that? And we can also do this horizontal one, and you can see how there are indeed 3 traces here. It's representing our 3 columns of data. So now I'm going to go back and go to our original zoom down on this lower left-hand corner. Another option which you can do is you can just change the values. LabView is so interactive, we can just change the values directly. And 10. So on and so forth. And I'm going to press play again and it'll go back to the default. Okay. So now okay, so that's a graph showing us all of the data at the same time. All of the data going through this double orange line. So now what if we want to only see one of those 3 columns? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another graph just like this one, but much smaller. Put it there for now, and I'm going to call it data section. Double click that to go onto the other side of things. Okay, now I'm going to introduce, if you haven't seen it before, one of the most important items in LabView, which is the index array. And that's just the little box that tells you what section of data you want to grab out of this 2D array. So I'm going to take an index array box and then wire it up. And then once you play with this, you'll figure out what it does by default, but just to be specific, I'm going to put a control on this top input. Ignore the bottom one for now. So on the top input, I'm going to say create control, and I'll call that data column. And as you may or may not know, everything in LabView starts at 0 as opposed to starting at 1. So the first column is actually data column 0. So if we want to see the first column, that's all we do. We wire it in, and notice how this is a singular thick orange line as opposed to a double thick orange line. A single thick orange line just means one row or one column of data. It's just basically one array of data. So now let's go and play it. So now we just see just one of these traces. And I can go to the different data columns, and they actually look so similar it's hard to tell the difference, but there's 3 of them. If I do the next one over, column 3, well, we don't have any data there, so it's blank. Alright, let's put this back to 0. Now what if I want to make some adjustments on the fly and have this dynamically update without me having to press play every time? Well, for that, what I'm going to do is use a while loop. And the while loop is a pretty simple structure. Let's find it over here. I've lost my whole thing. I'm going to get rid of this express, go to the modern. Oh, actually I don't need that at all. Let's get rid of that. Alright, go back to my functions. Alright, need a while loop. Go up to structures, grab a while loop, start in this corner and just drag. Actually, this is not enough space, so I'm just going to maximize this. And we're going to need a lot of space, so I'm just going to make this take up the whole area. I'm going to put more little tricks in here later on. Okay, so notice how this load data, and by the way, let me write some comments in here. Load data spreadsheet. You can make a comment just by double-clicking anywhere you want on either the block diagram or the function, either the block diagram or the front end. So I can write a comment here or whatever I want, and that's where I wrote down the URL for the web page, by the way. So okay, we have the load spreadsheet data here, and we only want to do that once. The loop, however, is for things we want to do multiple times repeatedly. And the I just tells us how many loop iterations, how many times all of this code in the loop was executed over and over again. And this thing here, this is a condition that needs to be satisfied. You either need to say stop or go. And so I'm just going to create a control. So I right-clicked on this little spot, got this stop icon. So when we're ready to finish, we just press stop on this. And I'm going to call this something different. I'll just call this I'm finished. And I'm going to make this button big, because in real life, if you're doing a lot of data analysis with this, you don't want to spend time looking for your button. And I'm going to make that little label go away by right-clicking and saying label not visible anymore. Okay, so there's our stop button. The VI won't run unless you satisfy that condition. Okay, so now let's try to run it. Oh, before I do this, very important, I stick a little timer in here. So in our programming thing, in the little stopwatch symbol, get this wait milliseconds icon. And so I'm going to right-click on this milliseconds to wait and say create constant. And this is just a blue number, which is an integer. And I'm going to double-click on that and edit it and say wait 20 milliseconds. And that just means in every loop, no matter how much time it takes to do all the code inside the loop, wait 20 extra milliseconds, okay? So now let's go and press go. So now we see we can change our data column